So today's video is about calculating percent of change and percent of error. So we're going to start by talking about percent of change. So what is percent of change? Well, percent of change is the percent of increase or decrease from one value to another. And there are two ways that you can calculate percent of change. The first option is that you can divide the amount of change, so the amount something changed, by the original amount and then convert that answer to a decimal. Convert that decimal into a percent. The second option is you can set up a proportion where you have the amount of change, so the amount something changed over the original amount, and it would be equal to a percent ratio. And because we're trying to calculate percent this time, we would have x over 100. So let's look at our first example. You work at McDonald's and make $6 per hour. You recently received a raise and now make $7.50 per hour. What is the percent of change in your hourly pay? So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to divide the amount of change by the original amount and then convert the decimal into a percent. So we first have to figure out how much did our pay actually change. Well, we went from $6 to $7.50. So if we subtract, we can find that we are now making $1.50 more per hour than we did before the raise. Then we have to look at what was the original amount. Well, we originally made $6 per hour before they gave you your raise. So we're going to take the amount of change, how much our pay changed, and we're going to divide it by the original amount. So we're going to do $1.50 and divide it by 6, which equals 25 hundredths. And then we're going to change that answer to a percent by moving the decimal 2 places forward. So then we know that 25 hundredths would equal 25%. So that means that you received a 25% increase in your hourly pay rate. So this next example, we have a pair of sunglasses, and the sunglasses are on sale for $24. So when you buy them, they're going to only cost you $24. Now, before they went on sale, the original price was $40. So we want to know what is the percent of change in the price. So we're going to look at the second option using a proportion. So we have to set the proportion up first. So when we set the proportion up, the first ratio is going to show the amount that something changed, and then on the bottom of the ratio is going to show the original amount, and then on the other side the second ratio will be x over 100 because we're trying to figure out the percent. So that's our unknown value, so that's where we'll put a variable. So again, we have to first figure out how much did something change. Well, if the sunglasses were originally $40 and now they're $24, if we do 40 minus 24, that will tell us how much it changed. And then the original amount, or the original price, is 40, so that will go at the bottom. And again, our other ratio, which is the percent ratio, would be x over 100. So then step 2 is, once you have set up your proportion, you're going to cross multiply to solve the equation. Well, of course, we know that 40 minus 24, if we simplify that, that means we will be cross multiplying 16 over 40 equals x over 100. And we've learned earlier in the last unit, how to cross multiply. So again, we're going to do 16 times 100 on one side of the equal sign, and then 40 times x on the other side of the equal sign. And we know that 16 times 100 will give us 1600, and then 40 times x will just give us 40x. We'll divide both sides by 40 in order to get x alone so that we can see what our missing value is. And that means our missing value is 40. So what that means is that there was a 40% decrease in the price of the sunglasses. So when you look back at example 1, we would say that for example 1, if we go back to that, we received a 25% increase in our hourly pay because our pay went from $6 to $7.50. So that was a percent increase. If we look at example 2, because the price of the sunglasses went down because it was on sale, we would say that this was a percent decrease. But both of them are percent of change. So the next thing we want to learn about in today's video is percent of error. And percent of error is the difference between a predicted or an estimated value and the actual value as a percentage. So you're going to represent the difference between what you predicted and what actually happened as a percent. And percent of error is very similar to percent of change. You're actually going to solve it pretty much the same way. Percent error is important because it tells us how right or wrong our prediction or estimate is. And percent error is commonly used by scientists, especially during experiments. So you guys can go and tell our lovely science teacher that you learned something about science in math class. So in today's video, we're learning about percent of error, and this is something very popular in science because they like to see when they're doing their experiments how close or how far they were from their estimate, how close their predicted value or their estimate was actually from the actual value. So make sure you tell our science teacher that you learned a little science today in the video. So how do we calculate percent of error? So there are two options again. The first option, you can divide the amount of error by the accepted or the actual or the real value and then convert the decimal into a percent. The second option is to set up a proportion. So the proportion would be the amount of the error over the actual value equals x over 100. So let's look at an example. So our first example, we have a student and they made a mistake when measuring the volume of a big container. He found the volume to be 65 liters. However, the real value for the volume is 50 liters. What is the percent error? So we're going to do option 1 where we're doing the division. So we're going to divide the amount of error by the accepted or the actual or real value and then convert the decimal into a percent. So the first thing we have to calculate is the amount of error. So if we look on our example, that we know that when he measured the volume, he measured it to be 65 liters, and then he found that the actual volume was 50 liters. So the amount of error would be 65 minus 50, which we know is 15. So then the next thing we have to do is we have to divide the amount of error by the actual value. So we know that the error was 15. And then we know the actual value or the real value for the volume was 50. So we're going to do 15 divided by 50, which will give us 3/10. Then we're going to change that answer to a percent. So we know 3/10 changed to a percent is 30%. So we know the percent of error is 30%. So we know that he had a 30% error in his calculation. So this example, we're actually going to use option 2. So a man measured his height and found 6 feet. However, after he carefully measured his height a second time, he found his real height to be 5 feet. What is the percent error the man made the first time he measured his height? So we're going to do option 2, which means we're going to use a proportion. So we're going to have to set up the proportion. That's our very first step. And when we set the proportion up, we're going to set it up as the amount of error over the actual value, and it's going to be equal to our percent ratio. And this time the percent is the value that we don't know, so we're going to use x for the percent. And remember, we always put our percent ratio over 100. So we'll start by figuring out the amount of error. Well, he measured the height to be 6, but then found his actual height to be 5. So we're going to do 6 minus 5 to get the amount of error. And then the actual value or his actual height was 5. So that's going to be at the bottom of our ratio. And then again, our percent ratio will be x over 100. So then the next step is that you have to cross multiply to solve the equation. Well, we know that 6 minus 5 will give us 1. So our ratio will be 1 over 5, or 1 to 5 is equal to x to 100. And we're going to cross multiply to figure out what x is equal to. So we're going to do 1 times 100 on one side of the equal sign and then 5 times x on the other side. We know that 100 times 1 gives us 100, and then 5 times x will give us 5x. We're going to divide both sides by 5, and that means that x would equal 20. So that means his error was, he had a 20% error in his calculation of his height. So the one thing you want to look at with percent of change and percent of error, percent of change is all about the percentage that something changed, either increasing or decreasing. And percent error is the percent of error from a predicted or estimated value to the actual or the real value.